As I said, 1 Corinthians chapter 6, we're going to finish chapter 6 today. We're looking at verses 12 through 20, and I need to issue a parental warning as we start today. We're going to be looking at the issue of Christian morality in an immoral world, and Paul is going to be looking at the issue of sexual immorality quite bluntly. So I'm going to let you know that we're going to be dealing with some topics here. We're going to be doing some things that might make people a little bit uncomfortable. I'm not going to be graphic. I don't intend to be. But we will look at some things, including a passage in Scripture that, quite frankly, is a tad racy. So I'm just going to put that out to you to be prepared for that and to think about how you want to go through this. But I just don't want to shock anybody today, but I do think I will hold it together without getting too crazy. But we're going to look at some things today. I want to start by reading this passage and letting you get a sense of it. Now, I want to give you a context here. The next passage that's going to come up after we finish this is Paul is going to be talking about marriage in chapter 7. And people have been very upset with Paul's discussion of marriage in chapter 7. I think you can see why if you look over to chapter 7. I admit, in all the weddings I perform, no one has ever asked me to read from this chapter as part of the ceremony. And I think you can see why there. I'll start with verse 8. Now the unmarried and the widows, I say, it is good for them to stay unmarried, as I am. But if they cannot control themselves, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. Not the most romantic imagery you will find in Scripture talking about it. But I want you to understand that what is this is falling on the heels of is Paul's discussion here in chapter 6. And what he's trying to establish is this understanding. There is a problem with sexuality in the world. There's a horrible problem. And what Paul is doing is he's going to confront with very basic, very plain, factual talking. He's not trying to wax eloquent about marriage. He's trying to just lay out a problem that says that in a world this messed up, marriage may be one of the great lines of defenses. So quite frankly, he puts it in rather stark and cold terms. And I hope you'll see why he's talking that way when we finish with our section today. But let me read this for you. And I hope you pay attention here because this first line in chapter 12 is kind of interesting and makes you kind of wonder about our theology. And look at what Paul says here. Everything is permissible for me. I want you to hold on to that and think about that for a second. What is Paul saying? Everything is permissible to me, but not everything is beneficial. Everything is permissible for me, but I will not be mastered by anything. Food for the stomach for food. But God will destroy them both. The body is not meant for sexual immorality, but for the Lord, and the Lord for the body. By his power God raised the Lord from the dead, and he will raise us also. Do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ himself? Shall I then take the members of Christ and unite them with a prostitute? Never. Do you not know that he who unites himself with a prostitute is one with her in body? For it is said, the two will become one flesh. But he who unites himself with the Lord is one with him in spirit. Flee from sexual immorality. All other sins a man commits are outside his body, but he who sins sexually sins against his own body. Do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit, who is in you, whom you have received from God? You are not your own. You were bought with a price, and therefore honor God with your bodies. There's a beginning point here I want you to get. Context, as I told you, is everything in Scripture. Understanding the context. Why is Paul addressing this in the way that he is? Now, first off, I want you to notice that first verse, verse 12. What does Paul say there?
You can do anything.
You can do anything. I can get away with anything. Really?
Murder.
What's that?
Murder.
Murder? I want you to think about this. Is Paul literally saying that a Christian can get away with anything and God will forgive it?
Well, if you look at the passage right before, he says a whole bunch of people that do all this stuff are not inheriting the kingdom of God. So in context, he's not saying, oh yeah, you can go do all those things. That's fine. They're not a big deal.
That's an interesting take, John.
Mine has a footnote that this is possibly a quotation of the Corinthians that Paul is kind of starting and going to correct.
you're on to two things here. I want to give you this. Paul actually is saying this to a degree. To a degree, he's actually agreeing and saying, yeah, in the broadest sense, a Christian can be forgiven for anything. Absolutely anything. But he has to put it in the right context. And you're on to some things very important here to understand this. I want you to understand the backdrop. Here's the backdrop. And you're right, you're on to something here. Paul is addressing two things in the culture that are very important. Two things that we've talked about in some depth before to give a common understanding here. But it was an immoral culture. We have to admit that, right? It was an especially immoral culture in Corinth. Remember, the Roman world was as messed up as it was so disgusted that it thought it was superior to Corinth because of how bad it was. In fact, they had coined a phrase. Remember that phrase? When someone really went off the deep end in sexual immorality and the worst kind of immorality of any kind, it says they had become Corinthianized. That was how bad. The Romans were disgusted by them. That's how bad it was. And they had this whole sense of things going on there. They were Corinthianized. And so they had a view of things that was a real messed up thing. Keeping a stand, marriage was not held in high esteem. There were a couple things going on. First off, they had built this philosophy. And this philosophy said, you remember this one? Sex is just biological. It's just another bodily function, just like eating and drinking and anything else. Why get so hung up on it? They had this libertine attitude, which has gone down through the ages. This is one of the things they started. That they had this idea that it was no big deal. On top of that, they had added some other little things that goes on here. They had said this, so why limit yourself? But they loved philosophy, and they loved this philosophy that they had found, they felt it was very religious, very insightful religiously to say this. Here's what they believed. What really matters is the inner you. It's the spiritual you. This is not you. You are this deep inside individual. And what we see out here is no big deal. And quite frankly, it's no big deal to this degree. No matter what your body does, it has no impact on who you really are. And we shouldn't get hung up on the things about mistakes and problems and things done in the body. That's all physical stuff. It's the spiritual you that really matters. That inner you. Now, I want you to think about that. Does that sound too really different than a modern view of things? I mean, what is the whole self-esteem based on? You shouldn't get hung up on mistakes and problems and things because the real you is the best you can be. Inside, you're wonderful. And as a matter of fact, we even have this whole thing in our culture. We've adapted these things. I've followed a number of political leaders and other spiritual leaders and people out there that will make comments about this, and they'll get caught openly in a lie and making comments, and they'll say, but that really didn't matter because the goal I was after was so important that lying about it really wasn't that big a deal. It really wasn't. You shouldn't get upset about that. You have no business judging me for that because the me inside who wanted this great goal was so important that doing evil things to get there shouldn't be a problem. Now, here's where they had tied this in. They come along and they see Christianity. Now, I want you to think about some of our doctrines that they immediately key on. Here was one. To be absent from the body is to be... Well, there it is. The body is discardable. It's just going to go to the grave and go to dust. It's no big thing. It's the you, the inner you, that God is going to take into heaven. So let's not worry about physical activity. That is that. They love that whole idea. They love the idea that God was spirit, but they especially love this one. The idea that God's grace is sufficient to cover how many of our sins? All of them.
What's sin so grace good about it?
And here we go. This is a great religion. It's all about spirit, and it's all about the fact that no matter what you've done, God's okay with it. God's going to let it go. And since what happens in the body didn't matter, and since God is going to forgive everything, this is the most perfect religion in the world because it offers fire insurance, which is exactly what I should have because the physical means nothing. Get their thinking? And can you see how our doctrine actually fed the idea as long as they only looked at select parts of it? So here's what they're coming to. We have a pass. And they're looking at Paul and going, who are you to discuss any kind of immorality or problem with our conduct with us? Because your faith says it's no big deal. Your own teaching says that God's going to let it slide. It has no impact on life. Now, how should Paul answer this?
Laughter.
Yeah, there's one. And there's a little mocking in this. Now, he could go a couple of ways. He could go, well, you don't understand the whole idea of forgiveness. You don't understand what we owe God. You could talk about sanctification. He could get very theological and go into this whole thing about how, but he's going to do this. He said, tell you what, I'm going to accept your basic premise. God forgives anything. I could, right now, as Paul, go out and do any stupid thing, and God's going to forgive it because I'm under grace. I'll give you that. But even if that's true, he says, there's a problem here. This whole idea of yours that nothing matters done in the body, that none of this issue is going to really come home to roost, he goes, that's not true. He's going to hit us with three basic things here. He's going to start an argument that says this. The Christian needs to avoid sin, especially sexual sin, because it harms, it controls, and it perverts. He goes, even if we could get away with it, it's stupid to do it because of these three realities. And here's where Paul's going to start. Notice how he gets this. Is everything permissible for me? Yeah. But not everything is beneficial. Not everything is profitable, is another word that might be put there. He says this. Some things are just stupid because they cause problems. Now I want you to think about this for a second. Does Paul have a case to make to the world that sexual sin causes some problems in the world? Can you make it? If you're going to have to make a case, prove it to me. Come on. Where does this sexual liberty come after me? I'm telling you right here that you have no right to get involved. Christians are always told this. You're so hung up on sex. You just want to put your nose in everybody's bedroom. You want to get involved with things that have nothing to do with. You're just obsessed with this thing. Why does it bother you so much? I want to answer those two questions. Why does it bother you so much? Is there any evidence that the world's approach to sexuality breeds problems? Let's start with the broadest thing. Culturally, as a culture as a whole, can you see any downside to how the world is approaching this? Any examples? Anything you want to throw out there? Do you think might be?
So many, where do you start?
Well,
Children
the
without fathers.
STDs are through the roof now.
Okay.
Suicide?
Suicide, off the charts, yes.
Abortion.
Abortion, off the charts. Of course, that's not a problem. That's a moral choice of a woman's body. How dare you even bring that up? Anyway.
The destruction of the family.
The question of the family. Let's start with the broad strokes. As a matter of fact, let's go to that one, the whole thing of the family. We now have, for the first time in our history, more children born outside of wedlock than in wedlock. First time. More of our children are going to be born to single parent structures than are born in a family. Any downside to that you can think of that statistics have talked about?
Private property.
Well, there's an interesting one. There's an interesting one. Here are some facts. Now that we have moved sexuality outside of the confines and the structure of marriage and saying that that is supposed to be part of a marriage relationship and the raising the children is supposed to be part of that, here's what we've seen. The children of these homes now have a dramatically lower high school graduation rate. They have a dramatically higher chance of mental illness, a dramatically higher teen pregnancy rate, a dramatically higher level of gang involvement, a dramatically higher rate of drug use, a dramatically higher suicide rate, a dramatically higher level of criminal activity, a dramatically higher poverty rate and welfare dependency rate than at any time in U.S. history. As a matter of fact, the number one contributing factor to child poverty and child health issues has to do with being in a single parent home. That's the reality. And just as an aside, here's one for you, and here's one for Ocasio-Cortez and her comments about male masculinity. 75% of mass shooters come from a single parent home, no father in the home. Of the remaining 25%, the majority of those come from a home where dad was abusive or absent most of the time. Think there's a connection to the problems we're talking about? Is Paul maybe on to something here? Yeah, John.
John Stone Street, who works with the Colson Center, has a saying that I think is appropriate here, and he says, ideas have consequences and bad ideas have victims. And I think that's, key to what you see here is, as our culture comes out with ideas that it promotes as wonderful, that are really very bad ideas and evil ideas, there's victims to that.
And in our case, culturally, the greatest victims we have are our children. The ones we're supposed to be most concerned about. That's society. Now, how about for individuals? Do you think there's a downside here? Give you some numbers here. Pornography addiction right now is at epidemic levels in our country. Currently, try this one. 77% of Americans view pornography at least once a month.
Wow.
77%. This is most interesting. A recent article in Psychology Today made this observation. Said that pornography has become as addictive as hard drugs. Try this. Such an addiction, and this is from Psychology Today, not a Christian source, it short circuits the brain. Now that's an interesting comment. It short circuits the brain. What is it meant by that? It greatly affects our ability to relate to others, leading to isolation and depression. People become socially inept in the most basic kind of interaction. Isn't that bizarre? There seems to be a problem with it. People become socially inept. It says this. They flunk this. A number of people in our culture today are saying that they involve pornography to spice up their married life. What did they find out about that? Did it really help married couples? No, it actually led to less interaction sexually in the family. It meant to more isolation, greater depression, and it doubled the rate of divorce. Doubled it. People develop problems with intimacy continued by married couples. It doubles, as I said. It reduces our ability to be empathetic. Try this. It causes us to view people as objects.
Imagine that.
Yeah. The chances of violence between couples goes up because you view people as an object. So maybe Paul's right. Maybe there is a problem with this stuff. It found this. It reduces productivity. It increases the instances of risky behavior. This is interesting. People get used to hiding this because they don't want you to know they're doing it. And it starts to lead to other kinds of risky behavior, including a lot of financial problems. Bad decision making comes out of this because you get used to hiding things, and you get used to the idea as long as you can get away with it, nobody sees it, you can try riskier and riskier things in all aspects of your life. A few other facts. You mentioned this one, Ryan. Over half of those who are sexually active outside of marriage develop an STD at some point in their life. It has become so epidemic that most people don't recognize they have the STD until it's advanced. And then they have serious and often permanent problems from it. Another thing, nearly 83% of all syphilis cases and 70% of all AIDS cases are among homosexual men who have a higher number of sexual partners. On average, a homosexual man will lose 20 to 30 years off their life expectancy. The average living period for a homosexual man is 42 years. Yes?
And monkeypox also is almost exclusively a homosexual disease.
Absolutely is. This is one that's coming out there. I'm listening to this on the radio and on TV when people are talking about it. They'll say this. It is caused by close physical contact. And immediately I had to ask this question. How close? Because that's a euphemism, and when we found out they talked about sexual activity and it almost is exclusively happening in the homosexual community. Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm going to go out on a limb here. I'm going to say I think there's a downside to the world's view on sexuality. Yes.
You find it ironic that, several years ago when the Me Too movement, came out and all the issues with women in Hollywood and that movement, which had some good aspects to it, And then shortly after that, you have Hugh Hefner die, and he was celebrated like an icon, and he did nothing more than objectify women his entire life.
Sexualize women to an
Yeah.
extreme degree, yes.
And it was weird that you had all these people in Hollywood who were pushing this whole Me Too movement, you know, kind of thing. And then when Hugh Hefner dies, they're celebrating how wonderful he was. It was like, do we not see
The disconnect on this in morality, I find that as well. There was a case not that long back, well, maybe not in my lifespan, long back, of a Hollywood director that abused female children on his set. And he was considered such a genius that when he fled the country to avoid prosecution, people still praised him as revolutionary, cutting edge in the kinds of things he brought forward, and he was definitely worth looking at his films. I'm just stunned by the lack of understanding. These were children. These were children.
Probably Roman Polanski.
Yes, sir.
He was real.
Yes, Mr. Polanski is the one I would talk about. Now, let me ask you this question then. And this is what I'm hearing from the world. The world is saying we are just so uptight sexually that it's really our problem. We're just putting our nose everywhere that it doesn't belong and talking about these things. Is it really Christians who just can't get away from being obsessively talking about sex as an issue? Do you really think that's our problem? I'll put this out to you. Among millennials in this country, that's age 23 to 37 right now, the average man has had 13 sexual partners, the average woman 12 at this stage in their life already. Among gay men, 83% have had 50 or more sexual partners, 43% have had 500 or more sexual partners, and 28% have had 1,000 or more sexual partners in their lifetime. I'm just looking at this and I'm wondering, and right now, as I said, the leading issue that everyone wants to talk about is to tell you what letter of the alphabet soup you fall into, so the most important thing you can tell me is about your sexuality. That's where we're starting and that's where we're going with things. Try this one. The leading porn site in the U.S. had 93 billion visits in 2021.
Wow.
Billion, with a B. And that's only one of the sites. Only one. Researchers are telling us that the number one use of new VR technology, that's virtual reality, will be in the area of pornography.
Wow.
And right now, companies are literally spending billions of dollars in research to develop sexual surrogate robots. Now, I'm going to have to say, I don't think it's really the Christians that seem to be obsessed with this topic. And when Paul says here in this passage in 1 Corinthians, he goes, everything is permissible, but everything is beneficial. That is really laying back on the damage that can be done by this problem. He's addressing a world that wants to make this no big deal, and he's telling you this is a big deal. This destroys lives. This shatters things. I want to go to a passage today. I give you a parental warning. There's a little bit of racy material in here. I don't think it's going to be worse than your kids get from an average commercial. But in Proverbs chapter 5, there's a discussion on this whole thing about sexuality that the Christian should observe. And I think it's important to look at this. Chapter 5, starting in verse 3. I don't know what yours says. Mine says a warning against adultery. A very simple approach here. Let me read this for you. Starts out, my son, pay attention to my wisdom and listen to my words of insight, that you may maintain discretion and your lips may preserve knowledge. You see the setting here? Getting stupid in this area says it's going to make you really stupid. You're going to deny knowledge. You're going to go off into a track that is just absolute nonsense. So watch yourself, and maybe you should listen to this. He says, for the lips of an adulteress drip honey, and her speech is smoother than oil. But in the end she is bitter as gall, sharp as a double-edged sword. Her feet go down to death, her steps lead straight to the grave. Now, that's a rather stark contrast, and I want you to understand that what we're going to see as we unfold this in 3 chapters of Proverbs, we're going to go through this quickly, is really the plot to most of what Hollywood considers to be wonderful romance stories. That's how it's going to be sold here. And he's saying, no, it's not what it appears to be. It's not what it appears to be at all. Verse 6, she gives no thought to the way of life. Her paths are crooked, and she knows it not. She doesn't know what she's doing. She has no idea what she's doing here. She's got to watch this stuff. She hasn't thought it through. She doesn't understand the consequences of this. Don't you love that, the story in Hollywood? A woman caught in a loveless marriage. And then she finds the true love of her life. And now almost all of them seem to follow this kind of pattern. Some of the favorite Hollywood movies, I would challenge you to look at that. Something like You've Got Mail, or Sleepless in Seattle. Family favorites, right? Look at the setting and tell me if that really should be something we see as a model of love and romance. Here we go. He gives a warning here, starting in verse 8. Keep to a path far from her, do not near the door of her house. That's solid advice. He's going, she's out there, she looks good. He's not denying she doesn't look good. Remember how he started the story? It always looks good, doesn't it? I shouldn't say I love, but I'm always stunned by having to counsel a man that I find caught in an adulterous relationship. You know what the excuse almost always is that I'm told by the guy?
I don't love her anymore. Or she doesn't
My,
love
my wife, we just don't talk anymore. She's not interested in me. I'm lonely, and this woman found me interesting. Of course she did. Now let's put a couple of things out there. I love talking to him about this. The newness always looks good, doesn't it? Think back to your early time when you first met your wife and you didn't know each other yet, right? His stories were interesting then. You didn't know any of them. The jokes were funny because they were new. They're still funny, and there's the beauty. I love how that comes down through this. And they'll talk about that, and I'm going, here's your problem. You stop growing together in any way. And of course, the new relationship, because you're interesting for the first time again. The stories are new to her. It's a discovery period. The jokes are funny once again. It all seems good. But the problem is, if you put no more effort into this one than you did the last one, what's going to happen when she gets tired of hearing that? Same thing is going to go there. It's bound to go that pathway. I love how he talks about this, verse 8. Look at that again. Keep your path far from her door. Don't go near her house, lest you give your best strength to others and the years to one who is cruel. You get that? He's saying, if you stay with this long enough, the thing you think you're leaving behind is going to what? Come right up into this one. She's going to be as evil as you thought the last one was.
Or worse.
Probably worse. Here's a number for you. What are the odds of a second relationship working? People have said, I've learned so much after giving up that first one. I've grown so much, and I'm better suited to a relationship now. You know what? They decrease with every one. In fact, our divorce numbers are actually skewed by serial divorcers. People who have had multiple divorces, because second, third, fourth, the chances get less each time.
It's easier every time.
You don't learn anything except that it's easier.
And you know how to do it.
And you know how to do it now.
Expert.
You're an expert now. And lest your ears one who is cruel, lest strangers feast on your wealth and your toil enrich another man's house. Now, here's some solid advice. Anybody who's gone through this knows this. Divorce is devastating financially. You enrich the lawyers, you enrich the people, but anybody but yourself, and certainly not the children that are involved, are not enriched with your money anymore. People get a piece of it, other than the people who deserve it. I love this. In the end, your life will groan when your flesh and body are spent. See that? You're going to wind up lonely. You're going to wind up in a bad place. It's not going to work the way you thought it did.
And you're going to have to work till you're 103.
Yeah. There's a commercial out there. I don't know if you've heard. There's a life insurance company, a guy called Big Lou.
Yep.
It's all over the radio. And Big Lou goes on about this, and his whole pitch is, yeah, you're on your fourth wife, you don't know how you can afford to have life insurance without paying 3 alimony payments. And his catch line at the end is, Big Lou understands because he's just like you. And he's bragging on the fact that he understands because he's been as stupid as you are. That's where we're at as a culture. How, you will say, how I hated discipline, how my heart spurned correction. I would not obey my teachers or listen to my instructors. I have come to the brink of utter ruin in the midst of the whole assembly. There's going to come a point at which, I want you to understand, here's an interesting one. You know who some of the most depressed people in the world are today? This is, I find interesting. It's women's lib people from the early 60s who started the movement and said, I do not need this relationship that's critical to my life. And now that they're older, and now that they've had either no relationship or they've broken several, they have no family, no grandchildren, no children, you know what they're finding? They're lonely and depressed. That suddenly that career that was supposed to be so much more important than anything else in the world, because you have to self-actualize. You have to love you before you can love anybody else, right? How did that work out for them? Didn't come into this. Now here's his correction. Drink water from your own cistern, running water from your own well. What do you think he's talking about there?
Stay with your wife.
Stay with your wife. Now I'm going to ask you something. This is a desert culture. Water from your own well. I want you to think about, how do you get water from a well? You have to work at it. Does it jump in the bucket if you put it on the edge of the well? No. Maybe it takes some effort. Maybe you should come up with a couple of new jokes. Maybe you should start learning things about each other as you've grown and changing experiences. Here's one of the biggest things we've let off. Families do not gather around and talk at dinner time anymore. You know what that always was traditionally? The time when you caught up on what's going on in each other's lives. We don't even talk about that anymore. Yes?
When John and I were first married, we heard a report that was like 4 minutes. 4 minutes of meaningful conversation a day. So between a husband and wife was the average.
And you wonder why people are
4
distant.
years ago.
Well, I'm
So-
sure that's gone up since then.
Oh, yeah. So we always joke about that. Oh, I gave you my 4 minutes.
Sorry, time. Yeah. Vicky?
I was at Hobby Lobby a week or two ago and I bought, just for me because it amuses me, but it's true. It's just a little sign that says dreams don't work unless you do. And that applies to a lot of areas, including your marriage.
Absolutely. Put some time in. I'll tell you, one of the biggest lies I've ever been told, and it ticks me off, and people would think I'm crazy on this, when advice comes along, you go, you know, I'm going to pass this on. Young man, here's some marriage advice. You know what? The romance fades. You know, after the first few years, just don't expect it to be that exciting. It's going to get, it's going to go down, and you need to prepare yourself for that. Frankly, I think I'm preparing for failure. I'm telling you that this relationship is going to get less interesting, less enjoyable, and just get used to it.
Better be in a life of single man.
Does it change? Sure it does. It doesn't have that same level of looking at each other for the first time and finding, but I'll tell you something, relationships must be worked at to be a relationship. Comes down to this. Drink water if you're running water. Should your springs overflow in the streets and your streams of water in public squares, keep your water in your own bucket. I know. Let them be yours alone, never shared with strangers. I'm sorry, this is talking about male procreation here. May your fountains be blessed and may you rejoice in the wife of your youth. And I want you to stop right there, because I've heard commenters say this. They're going, enjoy it while you're young, is what he's saying here. That is not what he's saying here. Enjoy the wife that is no longer of your youth as if she were the wife of your youth. Work at enjoying her at that level, just like you used to. That's what's supposed to work here. And here it gets racy, folks. You would need to plug the kids' ears, whatever. Here it comes. You think that Christians are hung up? You think we only think that sexuality in a marriage is just for procreation? This doesn't sound like it. A loving doe, a graceful deer. May her breast satisfy you always. May you be captivated by her love. Captivated? Now, does that sound like the romance has to fade in a relationship? It certainly matures. But gosh, come on. Captivated by it. Why be captivated by a son? By an adulteress. Now, I want you to understand this. He's not, people put a prostitute. No, he's talking about a woman outside of your marriage. Any woman. Some other man's wife. And he's saying this. Why be cultivated by an adulteress? I love the title. Let's not call it something it isn't. Why would you be captivated by that? Why would you put your effort there? Because try this. Why embrace the bosom of another man's wife? Why? That is his question. Let's answer it. Why? Why would someone do that?
It's new, maybe, huh?
Again, we're back to that new.
They didn't cultivate the relationship with their wife.
Exactly. You're turning here to an adulterous relationship because you didn't have the wherewithal to do something right here. Now here's the question mark. Why would you do that? When you messed up the last one, what do you think your odds are of doing any better this time? If you've learned nothing about, remember this whole chapter started about wisdom, listen to wisdom? If you didn't listen to wisdom of that one, what do you think is going to be different this time? You really expect it to change anyway at all? But he also says this, you think that's all secret stuff? You all think that's there it goes? For a man's ways are always in full view of the Lord, and he examines all his path. Do you think God's not onto you? That he's not aware of what's going on in your life? The evil deeds of a wicked man ensnare him. The cords of his sin hold him fast. He will die for lack of discipline, led astray by his own great folly. If there's anything I've ever done in discipling men, it is this. Learn some self-discipline in life. Would you? There is nothing like this. And it starts with small things. Scripture is very clear about this. I'm going to put it out to you. Well, you know, I always start asking this. How many unfinished projects do you have in your garage? Good. First, we'll get you a garage. We'll get you some unfinished projects. I'm on to you. A person that will not complete tasks, a person that will not do the simple things, is unlikely to do the big things. That's simple. When do you start shopping for your wife for birthday, anniversary?
Oh.
How early?
Whenever
The night
Judy
before?
starts.
I'm not gonna put you on the spot. Too late for that, right? I always think, the one that shops at the last minute just throws, is that a thoughtful gift? Oh, that's tomorrow. How much effort are you putting into thinking about the person that's supposed to be the most important person, the most critical relationship of your life? Where's this going to go?
I think it's important that you point that out, is that whenever they shortcut stuff and go after something new and something they think is grass is greener and so forth, it's the lazy man's way out. He's lazy.
Is lazy. And lazy will hit every area of your life.
Thoughtless and lazy.
Get some things structured in your life. Start with the smaller things, because if you can't handle those, you're not going to handle the bigger ones. It matters. Discipline matters in a life. Paul talks about that with discipline. He goes through that
Yes,
again and
you
again.
know,
Yes. Fire away.
Discipline, you can try all your might to be disciplined, but if you don't have the Lord guiding you,
Yes.
and you haven't accepted the Lord as your Savior, you can't do it on your own.
No. No, you can't. And Paul talks about that being the power of God through. But again, once God has entered your life, the sad thing I find is most men, just one still doesn't. You have the power now. I would never counsel an unsaved person to try to do the things I counsel a saved person, because resources are not there. But for a man who knows Christ, I'm sorry, the excuses are done. Now it's time for action. Yes.
You know, and another thing men and women both need to do is compliment their spouse, but at the other time, when you hear somebody say something disparaging about their partner, wife, you know, to speak on it, you know, make a comment. I've been around a lot of guys in construction, and they get so upset that me and my wife liked hanging out together, and they talk about their, I say, how can you even claim to be in love if you don't even like her? I mean, you know, it's like all other gossip, it just soars, but you need to be brave.
You absolutely do.
You need to stand up and speak up.
Complimentary discussion, and I think this is one of the biggest aspects of character. What you're going to say about her when she's not there tells a lot more about you than what you say when she is there.
Exactly.
Yes,
And that goes both ways.
it certainly
Women are
does.
horrible.
I speak from a man's perspective up here, and I understand the scripture.
They're responsible.
Because of the feminist movement, we get away with it, like whenever you
Oh, yeah.
the guy is always wrong.
And understand, if people say this is a sexist book, look who the idiot is in the story. You notice it starts with the man who's led astray and so forth. Yeah, well, to put the woman in a bed. No, it makes the man the dumb guy. Can't quite keep track of what he's supposed to be doing here. Falls for all this stuff. You go into the next chapter, she talks about you. She goes out and finds him, and she says, I love you, I adore you, I've scented my bed with oil, I've done the, and then it comes down and finds out, why? Because my husband's out of town. And it sounds beautiful, and again, the story is just like in a movie because she wants you, she's adorable, she's beautiful, and she's available because her husband's gone. Little thing they like to leave out in the story. But all of these things come into this, and Paul's whole thing, and that what we're bringing this to part, there is a cost to being stupid. We pay a price for this. And Paul is trying to make us understand that. Have you ever read Psalm 51? This is the psalm David wrote after his falling with Bathsheba. You ever gone through that? I'll tell you, in that psalm, David clearly says, I was forgiven. God has forgiven me. But that's after, verse upon verse, of all the bad things that happened in his life. There are consequences to sin. Very real consequences. Does God forgive us? Will we carry those sins into eternity? No. Does that mean they do not impact us, being foolish here? No, it does not. They do impact us. We are hit hard by that. Give you a couple of passages and looking at this. This is in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, going back to 12. It says again, there's a cost, he says here. But now, 1 Thessalonians 4, verses 3 through 4. It is God's will that you should be sanctified, that you should avoid, there it is, sexual immorality. That each of you should learn to control his own body in a way that is holy and honorable, not in passionate lust, like the heathen who do not know God. And there's the thing you were talking about. You have to know God. But he's saying, here's the problem. You're acting like them, and you do know God. Your excuse ended. Your excuse is over. And that in the matter that no one should wrong his brother or take advantage. And it goes on to a whole issue of character that flows out of this. Understand this. I've had to say this again and again. You're with this woman. Well, God brought her into my life because he wanted me to be happy. Remember, that's the classic example. It's bad enough you're sinning. Now you're going to make God responsible for starting it for you. God brought her into my life. Well, let me ask you this. How much trust are you going to put into a woman who, one, is cheating on her husband and cheating with a man who's married? This is her character. Do you really think that is the basis for someone who in long term you're going to love and respect and you're going to have a wonderful relationship? That's where you're going to start this thing? Two people lying about what's going on in their world, and that's going to be the basis of a loving relationship that will last into eternity? I don't think so. Romans 8:13 says this, kill that aspect in your body. Kill it. Let's put an end to this, attack it, and be done with it. I love Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. Remember that when he says, when I'm boxing, I don't just swing it at the air. I actually intend to hit something. Then you ask Paul, what are you fighting? Paul says, my body. I'm going to bring it into subjection. I'm going to compel myself to do what is right. Now, why would you have to compel yourself to do what is right? Because we don't naturally want to. The Bible doesn't hide anything from that. Your body wants to do stupid things. It wants to. And let's not lie about this. Is it enjoyable? The Bible says for a season. For a season. There's a time when people are going to enjoy this stuff. Absolutely. Second Timothy talks about men getting worse and worse. And I'll tell you, we do, as people individually and as a culture as a whole. Sin fills a void. If you leave a spiritual void in your life, it will be filled. And sin will fill it. And then pervert it. All that is a backdrop to look at our passage here. I want you to look at what Paul talks about here, getting back into 1 Corinthians chapter 6. Everything is permissible to me, but everything is not beneficial. Everything is permissible to me, but I will not be mastered by anything. This is, I'm going to have some discipline here. I refuse to be controlled. Here's the aspect. It controls. Sin does control you. It is addictive. It always needs more. This is what they found out about the aspect of men getting involved in this, and women too, mostly men involved in pornography. It always takes more, just like it takes more of that drug to get the same high you used to get. It always goes deeper. It always needs to be more explicit, more out on the edge, and more of it to get the same kind of response. Any father that talks to his children about dating understands this. Why do we put safeguards? Why do we say start your dating in groups? Don't go to these kind of... Because any sexual contact always intends to have the next, it needs more. You will never be satisfied at that level. You will always want the next level. It is completely controlling. It pushes us everywhere. As we looked at that, as we said, the world is completely enamored with it. It cannot say no to it. That's why we've had to rewrite all these laws, because we know we want to have no capacity to control it. Therefore, we will call it morality. But he goes on here. And this is a little phrase they had, food for the stomach and stomach for food. That was the people that said it's just biology. It's just biology. It's just like any other physical function. Don't get upset about it. It's just like biology. And here's where they had that thing. Remember they said this, what happens in the body is inconsequential. It's completely about the spirit. The spiritual, the real you is what matters. The body doesn't matter. And you Christians should know this, because you say that the body goes in the grave and you're in the presence of the Lord. So you understand the body, what it does means nothing. It's all going to pass away. Paul has a little answer to this. The stomach for food and the food, the stomach for food. Here it is. But God will destroy them both. He's going, yep, that part does end. The body is not meant for sexual immorality, but for the Lord, and for the Lord for the body. By his power, here's God raised the Lord from the grave. And I want you to notice something here. Here's what Paul is saying. You kind of missed something in that when you thought about, you understand Christian theology. When you said that it's all about the spirit, nothing to do with the body. Remember that guy that we worship, that Jesus fellow? We probably ought to talk about him since you're claiming to use our faith. How was he raised? Bodily. Redemption involved not just the spirit, but the body. Why would Paul bring that in? Why is that so important to our discussion here?
Prove that what goes on in the body is important.
There's not a disconnect. You can't disconnect the two. You're exactly right. They are tied together. What the body does is a reflection of what you are spiritually. You can't say the two are completely separate.
That's right.
And that's where our culture again wants to say, well, this, you can't check. This is such an important thing. I can lie, cheat, steal to do this because my morals are so high that if I pursue evil to get there, you have to respect me for it because I'm doing something good in the long haul. You can't disconnect this. It's a bodily thing. By his power, God raised him from the dead and will raise us also. It's the same thing. Do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ himself? Shall I then take the members of Christ and unite them with a prostitute? You understand this? He's going, here's some ramifications. What you do in the body also affects you spiritually. It's a reflection of what you are spiritually, and what you do with it affects you spiritually. It impacts you. It changes what you are. Do you believe that? Do you think there's a connection between what you do and what you really are?
Oh, yeah.
Have you ever noticed that the more you do something evil, the more easy it is to do it next time?
Yeah. I got away with it.
I got away with it.
Yeah.
And we push that, and we push that. This is something we don't understand in our legal system. We're shocked that it isn't working, and we show people kindness, and they go back and do the same crime again. Who could have thought that would happen? Well, you know what? Scripture's talked about that for a while. You pursue these things. They're members of Christ. Shall I then take the member of Christ and unite it with a prostitute? Do you not know that he who unites himself with a prostitute is one in her body? For it is said, the two will become one flesh. What is Paul saying here? I want you to get this. Why he brings this up. We talk about that, two becoming one. He's saying something that people miss in this whole that the sexual act in marriage is meant to be more than a physical act. It is symbolic of a spiritual union. It is a reality of a spiritual uniting. Christians don't hate sex. We view it far more highly than the world. We see its significance in a way they do not understand. We hold it in the highest regard in its proper place and function. I think it is tragic that some Christian groups have taught that it's just for creation. I think I've heard this nonsense that it's not supposed to be any pleasure in marriage. It's craziness. God never said that. He has an elevated stature for it and says, why would you do that? This is supposed to be such a special thing. Why would you treat it with such disregard? Why would you do that? But he who unites himself with the Lord is one with him in spirit. And again, what we are is reflected in what we do. There's a uniting here. Here's the simple comment. Flee from sexual immorality. I love that comment. I love that comment, don't you? You always say, I'm going to tough it out. I'm going to show my strength. No, get out of there. Run away.
Quickly, each other.
Exactly. Get out of the house. Just go. Remember back in Proverbs? Don't go near her house. Why? Because she'll do something stupid. You will. You know, I'm going to read her one last time. We just need to work. No!
Carried away and enticed.
Yes.
By your own.
And understand that. The whole imagery there in Proverbs, it talked about the enticing woman and how good she looked. It wasn't her that caused it. It was being stupid. The guy was responsible for being stupid. In chapter 6 there in Proverbs, it says it. I looked out the window and I saw among the simple. That was the guy. It's the dumb guy over there. He's the one that's going to fall for this. That guy. The one that has no sense. Has no sense at all. He's going to go for this. Flee from it. All other sins a man commits are outside his body. But he who commits sin sexually sins against his own body. We just talked about all the ramifications of what that hits and what that does. There are issues going on here. But I love this one. Why is it such a big deal? Now, he's going to use an image here. Remember how highly the Jews viewed the temple? They were kind of picky about the temple, weren't they? You could do stuff anywhere else, but you didn't do it at the temple. That just wasn't, they were supposed to even have laws. That's what Jesus got upset about. They were breaking their own laws. They were not showing respect for the temple. They were conducting business in places they weren't supposed to. Why was the temple such a big deal to them? It was the dwelling place of God. God hung out at the temple. Remember the Holy of Holy things? Remember how they handled that? They were real particular about that, weren't they? They were serious about it. They understand there were ramifications for treating this disrespectfully because God resided there. Why is Paul going to use that as a symbol, an example for talking about our conduct in our bodies?
As well as the believer.
Guess what? Who's the Holy of Holies now? Where does God dwell? Here he goes here. Do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you have received from God? You get that? He resides here. God gave you that. Have you ever gotten on your kids for showing complete lack of respect or appreciation for a gift they received from a relative? Why are you so picky about that?
Like the Pink Bunny suit?
Yeah, like in the Silicon in the movie there, yes. But you might even admit that it was not a really great gift. But why do you push on them to respect that? Why is it important that they show an appreciation for that?
Because it was given to them out of love.
It was given out of love. And it's not disrespecting the item. What are you disrespecting? The person. You're showing a complete disrespect for the person. And that's what he's going after here. Do you not use the temple of the Spirit whom you have received from God? Do you have no appreciation for that? None whatsoever? You were not your own. Now here's the other one. Here's the argument. And we hear that today, right? It's my body. I'll do what I want. Isn't that the whole argument over abortion? It's my body. It's not your body being crushed and torn up and thrown into a waste can. I'm sorry. You can try to make that argument, but that's the whole thing. It's my body. I am in charge of my body. And what does he say here? For a Christian? Not really. Not really. You are not your own. Oh, man. That sort of goes against the whole idea of my rugged individualism. I've been watching John Wayne movies all week. I'm not going to be owned by anybody else. I make my own choices. Right? You were bought at a price. That's a pretty serious statement he's saying here. What is he saying you're showing complete disrespect for? The death of Christ. Therefore, honor God with your body. And Paul has brought this whole argument back around from all this stuff. Oh, it's the spirit that matters, not the body. All these things he's coming around and saying, where is it that people can actually see your character lived out? Where is it that people are actually going to see? If you are the residents of God, where are they going to see that? How are they going to know that character, except if it is lived out in what way? Through your body, how you physically live in the world. If you're not doing any of that, how do they know? You can't play that game and say, well, the real me. No. We're watching the real you.
That's right.
Yes.
You remind me of a time Doug and I were in a restaurant, and we were laughing, joking, and eating, and we went to leave, and this gal said, may I ask you a question? I said, what? She says, how long you two been married? And I said, well, we're going on 50 years in a month or so. And she said, I said, why? She said, you were so comfortable with each other.
Yeah. How can that be?
You know, and then she'd never seen us before. She knew nothing about us.
But they recognized a distinction. And all it took was two people that actually enjoyed one another's company.
It was funny. And then somebody else paid our meal that day.
So it's profitable.
I love it.
I'll ask you this, since you brought that up. Have any of you, if I ask you, and I'm not going to make you, can you tell me if you know of a couple that has a really good that it's clearly visible in their interaction with one another?
No.
Can't you tell? Yeah, there you go. You didn't know you did. You can tell. You can tell. And why can you tell? Because it's such a contrast to this world. Yes.
It always cracks us up because you see the magazines on the, in the supermarket.
Yes.
Married 1 year, how'd they do it or something?
Yeah.
The next month they break up or something, you're just like, no, you should be asking my grandparents, my parents who have lived.
10 years, Hollywood's longest couple. Hi.
When we were first married, we were like, what about Florbell and Ralph Reese?
Ralph Reese, yes.
And, my grandparents were still alive. They'd been married 60 years, and both their parents 30-some, and it's like, what are you doing? Asking these people who know nothing.
And it isn't because they saw him giving you a multi-$1,000 diamond bracelet, and they didn't see some incredible lavish. It was the simple interaction of enjoying another person's presence. This world is so hungry for that, folks. Does it matter about sexual sin? Yes, it does. It damages everything, and the world, despite the fact it doesn't want to admit it, knows it's different in just looking at a couple that has the right standard. And I'm sure several of you could tell stories of that, of having people see your relationship and go, what's your secret? It's not a secret, is it?
This, we were able to tell her that the Lord had really been in our
What an
life.
opportunity.
It's a way to tell about the Lord.
What an opportunity. Yeah, I remember we used to ride in the van pool together when I was still working, and the guys were just stunned that we wanted to sit next to each. That's all it took, that we wanted to sit next to each other in a van. You seem to like her. Why is that so surprising? But it was to them. It was to them. Yeah, John?
We had a rule that when we got married and had kids, we said, anywhere we sit, you will not sit between us. And you may sit around us, but you may not sit between us, you know. I married your mother, I didn't marry you.
There is an incredible strength to that. More daughters in this world are damaged because they have never seen a father regularly treat a woman in a way that they have an understanding of how a man should treat them when they start dating. It matters. I hope I didn't shock anybody or go too far off the path, but I wanted to drive home this point that there's a reason that we take the stand that we do. There is a distinction in lives. And this whole aspect, we write it off. The world wants to play games with it. They want to rewrite it. But sexual sin is the most damaging thing out there right now. Outstripping nearly everything you can talk about. It isn't that God is going to punish it worse. I'm just saying we're punishing our culture with this more than anything else we do. We'll close this up.